Hello, one and all, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast with myself, Fergus Crawley, and the Doctor.
It's me, Phil. You want me to say Dr. Phil Price, but my initial response would just be say Phil.
That's very, very humble and modest of you. It almost makes it seem like your whole PhD was a waste of time if you're not going to use the title Phil. What is the deep-rooted resentment you have for the word Doctor? Let's discuss. Let's just abandon the topic and just really deep dive on that today. Was your PhD worth it, Phil, if it wasn't for the title? Did people do PhDs for any reason other than that?
Right, definitely in terms of like what I learned skill-wise, like 100%. But I can imagine that people just want to do a PhD for having doctors.
I feel like in America, I don't mean that offensively, but I feel like the amount of, on LinkedIn especially, the amount of like abbreviations you'll see at the end of people's roles and names on American LinkedIn, I feel like people would go for the fastest pathway to PhD to be able to have the academic doctor title. But nonetheless, we have digressed before we have even gressed, so to begin. So I think the key detail is what we're going to be discussing today, which is the interference effect. We are going to break down what it is, the history of it, how it has sort of come to pass in terms of research and understanding, where people misunderstand it, where you should probably try and better understand it, and what impact it has on you. So, Phil, I'm going to do my rudimentary, non-PhD qualified overview, and you can either say, Fergus, well done, or you are an idiot, let me try that again.
And then I've heard you give your overview before, and it's very good. So,
wonderful. Okay, so no pressure. Let's make sure that my memory is serving me correctly. I think from there, we'll then hand over to you to sort of break down what that has led to in an academic setting and how it has been interpreted from there, because I think this is really the volta or the beginning of this concept is the sort of context in which I'm about to describe is where the term interference in this setting came from, and that has led to lots of other research. So, let's begin. I've already forgotten the date. Phil, can you sub me in for the date? It was the 60s, wasn't it?
No, the paper you're going to describe is 1980 it came out, so it would be
80s. Drats. Well, okay. Everything else from this point onwards will be fantastic. But essentially, Robert Hickson was studying under Professor Helosi, and Professor Helosi was an avid runner. Robert Hickson was an avid lifter. And to try and cozy up to his professor, having an influence on his grades, his future at the university, and just, becoming closer with the person that was mentoring him, he thought, I'm going to start doing some running. So alongside his powerlifting, he started running laps around the campus with Professor Helosi, and after 6 weeks or so, he started to feel like fatigue was building up and that the running was making his powerlifting training worse. So he thought, I have experienced something here which I would like to study. Mr. Helosi, given that I have been cozying up to you these past 6 weeks on our very friendly runs, this is something that I would like to pursue in an academic setting. He had permission to do so, and thus the following study was created. There were 3 control groups, A, B, and C. A was doing lifting only, B was doing running only, and C was doing both. A was effectively hitting heavy, mostly 5x5 leg press and squats every other day. B was doing, I think it was 45 minutes of hard effort running every other day. And then C was doing both of those things. And that is a key detail which we will return to. After 6 weeks or so, the study determined that the rate of adaptation and progress in the C group started to decline. And that is where the study concluded that interference occurred. From that point onwards, that is where the concept has sort of been born out of. It started to develop, and I think you and I will both agree that we would probably dispute the A, B, and C groups in terms of the logic and the composition and the quality of programming that was leading towards adaptation in the first place, which has kind of set a bit of a false precedent to begin with. So I think what's really valuable about the study is that it, first of all, explored that notion of concurrent strength and endurance training. It inadvertently highlighted that the most important thing when doing so is logical, sensible, and I guess sensitive programming rather than viewing them independently. And if it were to be done again in a modern setting, and I'm sure if you were to do this in a modern setting, Phil, not that you'd need to cozy up to any professors in your setting, you could just go and do it excitingly, then you would look at the A, B, and C groups a little bit differently. And you would adjust the C group so that there's a little bit less volume in each sport to account for 100% of maximum recoverable volume. But what Professor Helosi and Dr. Robert Hickson ultimately determined is that interference occurred when you are trying to balance both concurrently. And from that point onwards, in a research setting, interference is a concept that has since been explored to the point that where there are meta-analyses, and it's something that has become a core component of discussing the balancing of strength and endurance training concurrently. But I personally believe most people don't need to worry about. So first question, Phil, have I missed anything? And then second question, where did that lead to?
Well, okay, first question, very well done.
Thank you.
Excellent.
I'm pleased.
Only minor details, so like the endurance lot, they did 3 running and 3 cycling. So
there was cycling element as well, wasn't there?
But,
Yes.
But I think, but the main thing is like, it was like, you've got 40 minutes, try and run as far or cycle as hard for that amount of time as possible. That's kind of the only instruction that they got.
So it was very high fatigue inducing in all 3 groups, wasn't it?
Pretty much. I mean, it's very different from what we know now of, the appropriate programming that we often do to try and build up people over time. So it's no surprise that one of the groups did hit some form of plateau. But yeah, really good overview of the comparison of the 3 groups. Like clearly one group was doing like double the amount of work as the other 2. So it's interesting when the author, Robert Hickson, started in his conclusion, it was the addition of endurance training interfered with strength development. And that's where this interference effect has come from. It's used the word interference because of his description in that conclusion. So then what we now know is like, well, okay, is that because they've done double the amount of work? Is it because that it is specifically endurance training, which is what he was highlighting to? So there's a lot of things that we look back now and think, actually, we'd probably investigate this a little bit differently, but it's an incredible start point because, now we can do like a second study where we've got 3 groups, but you might have 2 concurrent training groups and they have different volumes, for example. Like you talked about reducing the volume that they're doing, so try and match volume it to the strength group. Would you see continual increases in strength as well? So there's a variety of ways that we can potentially go from it. But I guess from the 80s, it had this narrative of, okay, it is endurance specifically which is affecting strength, and that's where the narrative happened with subsequent research until I'd say probably you start to get to the 2000s, or there's a key paper that came out in 2013 where they started to see that there wasn't really much of a difference between the strength group and the concurrent training group. So that led to people starting to think like, okay, well, what modality did they use? In this case, it was cycling. What intensity did they use? They compared like moderate, 70% of VO2 max. All of those different factors. They started to look at training factors and how that might have influenced it. So yeah, you've moved from like, endurance training is interfering versus, well, actually, maybe there's other factors we need to take into account that isn't just adding endurance training. It's the problem. It's a number of different reasons. So we're still trying to figure it out, but like your conclusion, largely, and we can go into why, I think for most people, it's specifically not something that they might worry about.
Key detail to consider as well, and I know you're always very keen to reinforce this, is the quality of training history or skill in each of the groups that would go into studies like this, because it's very difficult to find people with a well-rounded training history that are willing to participate in a long duration study. So what I don't know, actually, and I don't know if we've ever had this discussion on our podcast before, is what your take on the quality of the individuals taking part in those A, B, and C groups were as well, because obviously that underpins what the outcomes would have been, because it was an intense bout of training. If you had a person that was relatively new to lifting, doing high volume, high intensity lifting 4 days a week, mostly lower body dominant, they're going to fall apart pretty quickly. In the same way, if you told someone that's a pretty inexperienced runner to go out and run 3 times a week max effort and then cycle 3 times a week max effort, their legs will fall off after a week, maybe 2. Then if you get somebody without a bit of strength and endurance concurrent training historically doing both, then that is going to catch up with them pretty quickly as well. So what was your take on I can't remember off the top of my head the context of the groups in the original study.
I think they were kind of, recreationally active is what they often use, which usually is like academic speak for someone at the university. I think they play sport, but not to a serious level.
Okay.
That's probably the usual one. I mean, definitely. The level of the athlete, I think, has a massive impact on this. If we look at the meta-analyses that have come out, there's one in 2012 and 2022, 2021. A lot of concurrent training research has happened now, and typically it does happen. They tend to use the same type of athlete just because that's who's readily available, really. So when they're looking at level of the athlete, usually in novice athletes, and a lot of the time in intermediate athletes, they don't see much difference between strength and concurrent training groups, because I always liken them to like a sponge in a way. They're really quite adaptable, and they tend to really see great improvements. But a lot of these intervention studies aren't using a intervention like Robert Hickson did, where he literally battered them for 11 weeks. If you read them out, they're not doing anything. You probably look at them and think, oh, that's not too much, really. They're not doing too much in comparison to what people do in your local gym. And so no wonder people aren't getting to that point where they're feeling quite battered, and then they start to see like a plateau or a decrease. And that might have influenced the fact that we see not much of an interference effect, especially for more intermediate novice athletes. It's because give them some training and they improve, whether it's concurrent or strength only.
Yeah, which I think is one of the most exciting things about those that are adapting to new demands, is that the opportunity to get quicker, quite literally get quicker, or get better quicker is there. That's what really drew me in the first place. Is I was fighting for 6 months, 12 months for 5 kilos on a barbell, whereas once I started actually trying to improve my zone 2 efficiency, oh wow, this week it was 6-minute Ks. 2 weeks later, it's 550s. That's a 10-second per kilometre improvement. Fantastic. And I think that's where it's important to try and look at everything within its context, because that's where errors can start to creep in terms of logical and sensible programming. And I think that's what I really want today's discussion to be about, is what can people actually take away from the studies that are out there to apply to themselves, rather than getting lost in the sort of paralysis by analysis. What does the research say that I've seen a lot of people fall into the trap of? So I think the framework to probably put that within to start with is a bit more of an understanding from your end on the quality of the meta-analyses, and then if there are any overarching conclusions that you think are scientifically robust for people to apply to their programming in general terms.
I mean, I have some rule of thumbs which I think apply in this instance. There's a few things which I think people see as, oh, there must be loads of information regarding it, and then when you actually boil down to the research, there isn't actually that much. Like, concurrent training is still, I think, research-wise in its infancy. So, for example, I gave a lecture for Omnia Performance recently, and we looked at the rest periods between if you did a double session day. So typically you see online, oh yeah, use 6 hours. 6 hours is like the optimal time to have between your sessions if you're training twice a day. And it's okay, where's 6 hours come from? And then you realise there's actually only one study which looked at 0 hours versus 6 hours versus 24 hours. That's the only study in that topic. I can't remember, we did another lecture and we found there's only one thing that looks at that. And it's just like, well, okay, there isn't actually that much. So in terms of like a rule of thumb, and we can go into discussions around different aspects and how it plays into it, I always try and think of it as you're going to have some sessions that are harder than others. That might be because they are a key session because you want to drive as much adaptation from it as possible. It might be a weakness of yours, or it might be just something that's very related to a goal that's of importance. These sessions typically will create the most fatigue in some way, or will create some kind of molecular response which might require a bit more time afterwards to recover. So if they are the key session, just make sure that you have enough time before it so you go into it fresh, and you have enough time after it to make sure that you are recovered, and then you can even organise other sessions around that. So like Omnia's programming, I think, is really good, especially if you're doing one of the triathlon templates, is implementing different endurance / swimming sessions at key points during the middle of the week where they're taxing, but nowhere near as taxing as like the heavy side at the beginning of the week or the very long duration stuff towards the end of the week. And it provides a bit more time for the athlete to actually recover from those big sessions. So that to me is appropriate programming, which would reduce any real effect of the interference effect. And the greater the athlete you are, the more you have to push the boundaries of training, because you're pushing to try and adapt more. Whereas like a novice athlete, you could train a little bit and still see great improvements. So they're the ones that will probably require, as a difference between, they require more rest / also less rest because they probably recover quicker because they're more trained. So yeah, it's just about organising the week to try and make sure that we minimise any interference as much as possible.
And I think one thing we haven't actually covered thus far is what that actual interference mechanism is. So essentially, the biggest conception for I guess that the whole cardio kills your gains, bro, came from the understanding was that cardiovascular training turned off MTOR, which is the sort of adaptive mechanism that allows for strength and hypertrophy development, and turning that off therefore means that your gains are being interfered with. I think a lot of the research that has come out more recently, and a lot of the sort of anecdote and trial and error that has come from more athletes participating in this style of training, is that it's not a on and an off switch, but it's a blunting mechanism. I guess the golden question, and something that you're probably considering on a regular basis in the research setting, is how aggressive is that blunting? Is it 2%? Is it 27%? We don't know, and I don't believe there's any way that can be measured reliably without a very, very well-trained focus group that have got ability across the board, as we've discussed in the past. So that the down-regulation of AMPK, and then there's the blunting of the mTOR, which are the two things that you're essentially trying to manage. So if you've got double training days, or you're trying to look at things within the context of a week, what you are trying to mitigate is you're trying to minimize that down-regulation of AMPK, and you're trying to minimize the blunting of mTOR. But by virtue of training concurrently, as a quote-unquote hybrid athlete, you are accepting compromise. That is the very essence of what this is. And I think that's what a few people have lost sight of recently, is that just this weird belief that there is no compromise. There is a compromise. That is the whole point of this methodology and why it was coined in the first place. So optimizing the suboptimal is a phrase we use often, and I think that is really what we're trying to achieve here. And moving away from the paralysis by analysis of trying to separate everything as optimally as possible in place of just doing the training itself, I think is where the interference effect became a little bit more confused in recent years. But I think there's more than enough evidence out there to suggest that with sensible programming, with a bit of adjustment, and actually looking at the moving, practical, consistent output over the granular detail, is that it doesn't affect most people as much as they might have previously thought it did. So you've already covered one, which is session timing, in terms of how to better manage that blunting of mTOR and downregulation of MPK, all the sort of actual adaptation mechanisms. Are there any other real top-line rules of thumb that you want to flag at this point?
Well, we can discuss the AMPK mTOR situation, because that's where a lot of people go towards, because I guess AMPK is a very specific response to endurance training. So like you break down ATP for energy for your endurance training, and that obviously increases the amount of ADP and AMP in the bloodstream. So the body then activates the kinase because it wants to regenerate ATP because it needs more energy to keep going with the endurance training. And like you said, there's this idea that if mTOR is elevated because you've done some kind of strength training, and then all of a sudden you do some endurance training, you get this subsequent increase in AMPK, and that starts to inhibit the mTOR. So to be honest, it's a tricky one, because there are a lot of the studies which show that blunting effect, like a switch, like you've described, has only happened in mice. You know, they're genetically more uniform than humans. We're much more different than that. There has been some very few studies which showed mTOR going to baseline pretty quickly, but they come from earlier on, and they involve bike sprints. But a lot of the most recent research has either sort of see no difference, or if there is a response, it's not really concurrent with, like, the more AMPK that you have, the more of a drop you have. It doesn't seem to be like that. So what I'm trying to get is, we don't fully understand it. But if you think what's happening at the muscle cell with training, like, that affects the muscle cell, but there's also nerve cells, lymph cells, all sorts of things. And when we try and measure progress and strength with more global exercises like strength and all that thing, where a number of different factors actually affect its improvement, like, this issue with MTOR and AMPK actually is pretty small, unless you are a very elite athlete, which you're doing high frequencies and high volumes of training.
Who do you think needs to worry about the interference effect? Is there any cohort of athletes, any specific sport that you think needs to pay more attention to this than anyone else? I mean, obviously we are in this world of concurrent strength and endurance training, but generally speaking, there isn't a league for that. You've got blended elements like CrossFit, Hyrox and things that have utilization of strength components within, but you are still training for the primary sport there rather than using S&C for primary demand. So is there a performance demand in any sport that you think requires more of an emphasis on understanding and mitigating the interference effect than anything else?
I wouldn't say sport specific. I think, it depends on what your goals are within that sport. So I had someone give me an example of an elite swimmer who needed to gain about 3 kilos to help with their power development for the butterfly. And they would swim, and then they do strength training directly after the swim, and they just couldn't gain the weight. What they found is that they just dropped that first swimming session, had the strength training on its own, and they quickly gained the weight. So it can happen in any sport, but that's not some magic.
But a key detail there is that person was probably doing 20 kilometers of butterfly a week as well, which is where
huge volumes.
And I think the mistake we often make with this is we go, great example. Look, they couldn't build strength after an endurance session, therefore you can't. Well, no. 20 kilometers of cumulative fatigue and swimming done for 3-4 hours a day is very different to somebody doing 2 or 3 swimming sessions a week. So again, as with all things, context is key, but learning what we can from individual context at lots of different levels is actually where the nuance and the lessons can be taken and therefore applied.
Yeah, it wasn't anything special what they did, really. It was just an understanding. So, okay, they do a lot of swimming, so there's a lot of endurance training there, and a lot of fatigue that comes with that. And all we did was just move training around. So we just prioritized the strength training, which they didn't initially. And there was no issue after that. Very quickly, no issue as well, even though they still maintained that high volume of endurance training. So it's even at that elite level, you can still see how easy it is just to appropriately program to technically avoid it.
And I think that's what's most exciting. That's what most exciting about what we get up to with one-to-one athletes and what we try and do with constantly iterating on the training plans and sort of the programming is what are the small tweaks that can make all the difference? Because for the vast majority of people, doing a little bit more training with a little bit more intent, with the right amount of recovery and the right understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, takes people an awfully long way. And we help facilitate that. But what's really exciting is you occasionally get someone that comes along with a very unique goal, and you almost have to go back to the drawing board a little bit. Like some good examples. We had somebody that was going for a world record tire flip, and I was looking after them, and I thought, right, okay, what are the big limiting factors that we've got at the start here? So their bicep tendons, big one. How much work have you been doing on your bicep tendons to this point? Have you been doing curls 3 days a week? Have you been doing 1,000,001 pull-ups? Or have you just been doing this, that, and the other? And it turned out there was a big focus there where I really wasn't confident in the volume of the bicep tendon demand. How much sustained specialist and specific output can you achieve on a week-to-week basis with access to the equipment, i.e. a big tire? Is that something you've got readily available? Is that something that we need to travel for once every 4 weeks? Etc., etc. What is this ultimately? It is an aerobic output, sustained, but it is applied in a sort of more strength endurance mechanism. So then you look at all this and you go, okay, right, how do we piece all this together with the same principles, with the same methodology to achieve the outcome desired? And those are the individuals that help you go, okay, if we make this small tweak here, that makes all the difference. If we adjust that there, then they responded really well. Is this something we can generalize? That principle can then be applied to somebody else training for something slightly less specific. And if a trend starts to form, that's where we can see the changes that can be the things that can really help people move forwards. And I think that's where the consolidation of stressors idea for us is something that we see the biggest results with in the quickest period of time, when people come to us that are truly managing strength output rather than just supportive strength output. I'd say if someone's actually looking for top-end strength development or maintenance, moving sort of surplus of 1.5, 2 times body weight, then the consolidation of stresses, there is a real inertia to break through where people think, wow, I'm feeling pretty beaten up here. This is high intensity. But it just allows them to structure their week and that sort of ongoing recovery in a much more sensible way, where after not much time at all, they feel like it's completely normal to them. And it means that as you sort of go through that reset process on a week-by-week basis, fatigue moves with it, which is a nice place to be. Whereas with DUP, I found you can often go into a session that requires quite a lot of you and you feel a little bit cooked. And then you think, well, do I scale back to another easy session and then I'll end up hitting 3 easy sessions in a row? Or what do I do here? So DUP doesn't allow for as much variability and adjustment when you are trying to balance strength and endurance training concurrently, because whilst the interference effects can be managed, and we're confident of that, you are accumulating fatigue in different energy systems across a wider fitness spectrum, which is going to have a more systemically demanding fatigue response within you. So responding to just running fatigue is one thing, that's hard work. Responding to swimming, biking and running fatigue is hard work as well. Now throw in some top-end strength development and some sets of 5 on deadlifts, and you're thinking, oh my goodness, why am I doing what I'm doing? Everybody has their own reasons, I'm sure, but that's where you need to be a little bit more sensible, a little bit more adaptable, and we found consolidating those stresses has been a really, really useful way to mitigate the fatigue-inducing effects of the interference that can occur. So I agree, actually. I think individual sport, it is the strength and conditioning for the sport where the interference effect needs to be considered, but not to the level that it requires anything other than paying attention to the feedback you're being given. I don't think there is enough that we don't understand about that mechanism where anything other than sensible programming and human interaction as well as data analysis can't overcome the issues that would be presented by the interference effect. Do you agree?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay, that's reassuring.
I like what you said regarding consolidating stresses, because to me, that's what makes hybrid programming a very specific methodology to hybrid performance. Now, a reason being for that is that you're training for 2 separate sports essentially, but your training doesn't reflect all this training for one and then all this training for the other. The consolidation of stressors is, okay, to be able to be good at these 2 things at the same time, what skills do I need? How can I bring that all together so I can develop them without doing too much, so that I just end up in an interference effect, not necessarily because it's specifically endurance, but just because you're just hammering yourself into the ground for trying to train for 2 sports. So that's where I think, we've argued the definition of hybrid training on a different podcast, but this is one of the key things, if people see it as a methodology, is that consolidating stresses means that you're training for 2 separate sports as if those 2 separate sports are one. And by doing that, you also mitigate as much as possible anything that could create a interference effect, whether it be molecular, fatigue, or anything like that, in order to try and improve concurrently with 2 things.
I think the challenge here is that comes with practical challenges, with things as simple as on a Tuesday morning, there might be a tri-club swim at your local swimming pool that you want to jump into because of the community aspect, which means you're going to enjoy the swim a lot more. But Tuesdays might actually be your heavy upper body day. So you don't want to do that first thing in the morning in prioritizing the lifting side of things. But this is where the recreational athlete is juggling a lot more than just the outcome and the performance at the end. And understanding where interference can occur, what we can do to mitigate that, and when actually just showing up to do the training in the first place is the only thing that really matters. Because the context around the individual and the sustainability of an individual's training matters more than the granular day-to-day detail. And the last thing I'd want in that situation is somebody not going to the tri-club swim that they'd get a lot of value from because they felt that they binarily and dogmatically had to do their lifting first thing in the morning that day, and instead did the lifting miserably on a Tuesday morning knowing they were missing the tri-club swim, and then suffered through a busy post-work pool swim on Tuesday evening thinking, oh, this would be a lot more fun if I was with the tri-club in the morning. Because that's going to affect compliance. That's going to affect enjoyment. And if you're a recreational athlete, you're doing this for achievement and enjoyment. So I believe that other than S&C coaching for elite athletes whose entire existence, income, and KPIs are based on their performance in their respective sports, most of us just need to bear in mind a few simple things when it comes to the interference effect. Beyond that, we don't need to worry. And those simple things are, we'll play a game of ping pong on this one, Phil. I'll go first. I'll steal the easy one first, which you've already said and we'll summarise, is aim to leave 6 hours or more between your cardiovascular or strength sessions. But don't panic if you can't do that, practically speaking. That is the ideal, but it's not always the optimal because life gets in the way and we're not all professional athletes. So what else do people need to consider as a quick fire round to finish things off, Phil?
Yeah, it really highlights the challenge and the exciting challenge when it comes to a lot of hybrid athletes, because it's not a professional sport, but people train as if it is a professional sport. So you've got a number of different things to factor in, not just what happens to the human body, but, training intent, logistics, all that type of thing. To add to your list, I would go keep your hot sessions. So those key ones are incredibly important for whatever you're developing at that time. Make sure you're as fresh as possible, so your training with intent is as high as possible, and that they probably require more recovery afterwards. So some sessions you may be able to combine, other sessions you might not be able to because you need to recover directly after it.
Fantastic. I think I will map out my prioritization pyramid, my practicality prioritization, too many P's, practicality prioritization pyramid. There we go. I'm not going to make that a thing. That hasn't worked as cleanly as I thought it would, but nonetheless, the PPP. So in an ideal world, in terms of session ordering, we would go strength training first, 6 hours or more, cardiovascular training. In the context of a double training day, we have strength and endurance. If that isn't possible for practical reasons or otherwise, then the next best option would be endurance training, 6 hours or more, followed by strength training. If that isn't possible, and we're going even further down the sort of ladder of ideal priorities, then the next best situation would be strength training immediately, followed by cardiovascular training, which is probably putting you a little bit more into that area where we're down-regulating AMPK because MTOR is higher. And then a situation that is ideally avoided, but sometimes it might not be possible, because this is where there is much more of a skill degradation and much more of a fatigue-related degradation, is endurance training straight into strength training. Phil's given an example with the swimmer today of why that might not be most optimal, because you are going through lots of skill dominant sustained output work, which is going to degrade at a higher level than lower rep work would strength setting. So for example, if you're going on a 60-minute zone 2 run, you are going to be doing, hang on, I'm going to do some maths here. So let's say you've got a 180 cadence. 180 times 60 is 10,800 steps in an hour, which if you times by a multiplier of your body weight is a huge amount of cumulative load in that 60 minutes. If you then go straight into resistance training, you are carrying an enormous amount of load going into that, and thus the skill will be reduced. Is that the difference between a set of 5 at 80% or not? maybe not on that day, but it might be the thing that means that what was an RPE 6 is now an RPE 8, and that can get in your head. It can make you feel like you're going weaker. It can then begin that spiral. So that's the hierarchy. At the end of the day, those are all the ideal situations, but the thing that wins every time is doing the training, but developing the skill to know when to adjust the training based on the circumstances. Phil.
I would add, if you are continuing to improve, then that's the key thing that shows what you're doing is correct. So a lot of the time when people say there's an interference effect, it's because they've compared it to someone that's only training strength training. But you're not. That isn't your goal. So your rate of progression is going to be different because you're training for two things. And whether that's because you have endurance training there, or over a space of a week, you've done 4 strength sessions compared to someone that's only training strength and they do 6. Right, you're doing less strength training. It doesn't mean that your strength development isn't going to be, if it's reduced compared to the strength training only group by like 20%, cool. That shows that you're still improving a lot, and that's cool. If someone was improving at the same rate as a strength only group, in my eyes, that says to me they're progressing too quickly, and I want to see a more gradual increase because I want that increase to be more consistent
And sustainable.
If I try and keep up with the powerlifters, something's going to go wrong, isn't it? 2 different sports. One's hybrid, one's powerlifting. So we need. I know that the comparison allows for the interference effect, but in reality and practically, we don't really want that comparison because our rate of progression is going to be different because our goals are different.
Yeah, so essentially our understanding of the interference effect simply becomes a willing acceptance that there is a compromise on how much we can adapt in a certain space of time because we are allocating a reduced amount of adaptive energy to 2 or more sports concurrently rather than one individually. And to expect anything else would be hubris, in my mind.
Oh, excellent choice. Absolute hubris.
Not a word I pull out of the locker very often, but with all the books behind your head, I felt I had to, deep dive into my vocabulary. I think final thing to add, just to keep today a little bit more simple before we do a bit more of a deep dive in another episode on sort of exactly what the programming considerations are on this, is just if you are dealing with double session days or you're wanting to try and prioritize recovery to optimize the suboptimal, concentrate carbohydrates and nutrition intake around your sessions so that you're trying to maximize your replenishment of glycogen to go into session number 2, or that you are adequately hydrated, fueled, you're not falling behind as a result of spending an hour in a quite warm pool that morning that is then going to make you feel a little bit achy and beaten up going into your lifting that evening, for example. So, yeah, double training days, if you're considering session ordering in your programming, make sure that you treat your nutrition and your hydration like it's your job around it, because that is further going to mitigate the impact of one session on the other and is something that we generally have more control over and more of an understanding of day to day than we do to what level MTOR is downregulating AMPK, because that is not something that MyFitnessPal is going to tell you, I'm afraid, ladies and gents. If it does, then they've really improved their R&D, but I will wait with bated breath for that one. Anything you think we need to add before we close off, Phil?
I don't think so. There's a lot of topics for future episodes, so looking forward to them.
Very much so, very much so. And I think there's a few other concepts within this space that I think we could discuss. But I think breaking down these bigger picture concepts into what people need to consider practically, I think is something that I'm very much looking forward to doing over the next couple of months, Phil. And you're now in your wonderful new bookshelf podcast setup rather than the butterfly room. And you don't have a black eye this time.
No, my face isn't swollen. I'm not in a butterfly room.
And you're not concussed.
I'm not concussed. Well, I probably was concussed. I was just ignorant to it.
Which is the exact same as being concussed. It's even worse. Being concussed when you don't know you're concussed is that's not a nice place to be. A place I've been myself. So anyway, thank you very much, Phil. A valuable discussion for sure. Reminder, if anyone does have any specific questions or any future topics they want to hear us discuss, please stick them down below and just make sure to hit follow, subscribe, check out other platforms, etc., etc. Thank you very much. Adios.
Thank you.